I read the 1000 Autumns of Jacob de Zoet by David Mitchell. This is Mitchell's fourth book in a shared universe. I will be referring to the previous three books, so if you don't want spoilers for those books, you should stop listening. This is a historical novel that kind of defies genre categorization, I guess. It's a literary novel, whatever that means, in terms of it doesn't just simply tell a comfortable, historical romance or historical adventure or chronicle some certain particular historical event or have famous historical characters or any of this kind of stuff. It's like it does have actual historical events, and the setting is extremely well researched and presented, I think. But the story that it's telling is more complicated than a kind of protagonist-antagonist style story or a simple travelogue, or it's just more complicated and crunchy than that. So this novel mostly follows the life of the titular character, Jacob de Zoet, who is a Dutchman that lives on the island of Dejima around the area of modern Nagasaki, which was a kind of go-between liminal zone off the main island of Japan that was meant to keep foreigners contained like the Dutch, but allow for trade and cultural intercourse that would happen with the two cultures intersecting in this place, but mostly to protect Japan from Western influence and also to keep Japan secret from the rest of the global culture, kind of insulate it. Dejima was a real place. I had never heard of it before reading this novel, but I've read more about it since then. So it's interesting to have this kind of not very well-known place written about. That's one of the cool things about historical fiction, right? That you can kind of pick up new facts and learn about these things that kind of just get buried by the winds of time. It's not purely from the perspective of de Zoet, and we'll get more into it as I go along, but compared to Ghost Written or Cloud Atlas, this book more closely follows a single protagonist narrative, just like the previous book, Black Swan Green. We do move from perspective to perspective, especially after we get into part two. There are 5 parts to this book, but mainly in the first part of the book, we are in Jacob de Zoet's point of view. And as a newcomer to the island, he is in a great position, in terms of access for the reader to be learning about all of the things on Dejima Island that might be confusing for us, the readers, and then being kind of a access key character to unlock knowledge that will help us to understand the culture of the story and all of the complicated history that really did happen in Japan at this time. So this is set at the very end of the 1700s and beginning of the 1800s. That's when most of the action happens. And when Jacob comes to Dejima, he sneaks in a family heirloom that is like the Book of Psalms from the Old Testament, kind of isolated by itself, that has been passed down through his family, which is contraband in Japanese territory because Christianity is strictly outlawed. And so people are not allowed to have Christian scriptures or materials on Japanese land. This introduces the idea, I think, simultaneously of religion and of language, and the important themes that those are going to be in the book. I think a lot of the first part of the book feels a little bit more simplistic and Manichaean and typical of a historical fiction novel, maybe to ease us into the book if we're a new David Mitchell reader and we're just not familiar with how complicated he's going to make things. But, it would seem like, there's this well-meaning European man who's the son of a minister and he's, from Deutschland, and he has his Christian materials, and here's the draconian Japanese government that is intolerant of Christians and intolerant of Western ways, and they're not dealing fairly with the Dutch, and on and on and on. And so the Europeans good, the Japanese bad and backwards. And maybe by the end of the story, the bad Japanese will learn to be more like the good Europeans, and that will bring us to a good ending, right? But it's all going to get way more complicated than that. For one thing, Jacob knows that it is forbidden for him to have this book, and yet he has it among his things, which will be searched by Japanese officials. And if he were really kind of following the rules or being quote unquote good, then I think he wouldn't do this at all. It's an act of defiance against the nation that he has chosen to kind of immigrate to, at least temporarily for business purposes. Jacob seems to only be planning to be in Japan for maybe a year or two, just kind of serving out a contract with the Dutch East India Company to do some large transactions on some privately owned investments. And then hopefully he'll make a good enough profit to go back to his home and marry his girlfriend. But he kind of starts off the story, like I said, breaking the rules and doing so, I guess, for the sake of his religion. And that speaks to a kind of integrity to Jacob, that his religion is of central importance to him, of course. Like, that seems to make a lot of sense. Everybody who is religious holds their beliefs dearly, and those are more important than the rules of any given government, I guess. But it does strike me as, like, quote unquote bad or maybe even unchristian to openly defy a government when you're just going in there for a short period of time. He could have left this heirloom safely back at home with trusted people, but he doesn't. Why does this choice happen in terms of the storytelling? Like I said, I think what's going on here is we're being introduced to the idea as modern readers of a religious person. He has a genuine religious conviction when it comes to Christianity. Some readers might be atheists or agnostic or maybe even anti-Christian or some other faith that is not Christian when they're reading this book, and so might look down on Jacob or see Jacob in a kind of condescending way as modern people look back on historical people often, that like, oh, you simple-minded, psychologically naive person, you had to believe in Big Daddy God in order to exist, right? But I think something more subtle is happening here. Mitchell is introducing religion here because he's going to introduce a lot of other ideas right behind it that all have to do with ideology. And especially situating the story in this place, in this time, brings up the idea of colonialism and global imperialism that was just like running rampant out of Europe and all through Europe. And so before this, the reason that Nagasaki even exists is because of the Portuguese contact with the Japanese that happened long before this story takes place. And the Portuguese brought with them Christianity, but also the point of view of a European or Christendom mindset, followed closely, by the Spanish and then here by the Dutch. And we're in the very tail end of the Dutch East India's imperial hold on Eastern trade to Europe. And the Dutch East India Company, it's right there in the name, is a corporation that exists for profit and not centered around religious missionary work or anything like that. Instead, their idea of civilization has to do with buying and selling, and that is heavily informed by notions of racism, of European superiority, and other themes that were an important part of Cloud Atlas, but were also, I think, important in Black Swan Green insofar as if the Europeans color all of the rest of the world as backward, uncivilized people, then by default, in a backhanded way, it colors them as civilized and enlightened and the light of the world, right? The other thing that happens right up front here that's related to this idea is that we meet Orito, and she's actually the first character that we meet in the book. And she's a midwife, and she helps to deliver a baby who is stillborn, but then who miraculously comes back to life. But Orito is not a midwife in the sense that she has learned the lore of midwifery from other women that have handed these techniques down from generation to generation, stretching back to ancient times or something like that. She is more of a modern scientist and has learned European techniques of how to deliver babies and deliver medical care to people. And Orito cares a lot about knowledge, the transmission of knowledge. She is very hungry to learn new things. And she's kind of captured by a scientific ideology. And we might not usually hear that characterized as an ideology. It might just be like, well, the scientific method is the way of progress. That's the way it is, Alan. That's not an ideology. That's the best way to increase human knowledge and make the world a better place. But I mean, all of that I just said is very ideological. That is very much the way that groups justify their views as being, well, this is natural, quote unquote, this is best, quote unquote. And hey, like I'm recording a podcast on a phone, which was all delivered to me by science. I didn't like create this stuff myself or anything. So I believe in science too, but I try not to fool myself that I'm not believing in an ideology. And by contrast, religion is often not characterized as an ideology, but instead is characterized as an irrational artifact of the ancient world, and that it needs to be overcome, surpassed, transcended by the scientific view. And so again, you could see a kind of Manichaean duel between Orito's worldview of knowledge and science and Jacob's worldview of Christian belief. But if we put these on the same level or in the same category as ideological, then we get to also add into the mix here the idea of capitalism, which is what the Dutch East India Company is all about. Very early in the story, we get a mention of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, which is kind of the defining document, the Bible, if you will, if we're going to talk about capitalism in some kind of religious, ideological terms of capitalism. The ideology of capital is that there are infinite human desires and there are finite objective resources in the world, and that markets can strike a balance between those demands, those desires, and the harsh realities of what's actually available. Left out of that whole equation or unstated in the ideology is the role that people play in creating profit, managing profit, and how profit can distort or become its own source of desire within the system. So it's not a simple distribution model for finite resources to people who need them or desire them. Instead, it is a way of actually managing people themselves. So what's the point of bringing that up? Well, here early on in the story, Jacob starts to meet various co-employees of the Dutch East India Company who have been on Dajima for a long time. And they start to tell him their stories of how they joined the Dutch East India Company. And many of them did not join the company as free will agents making rational decisions motivated by profit or anything like that. Instead, they were press ganged, kidnapped, tricked. And why would the company want or need to do that when it's trying to operate a business that generates a profit? Well, because it needs to exploit people in order to achieve that profit. That is the dirty little secret of capitalism. Someone needs to get ground up in order to create the flour that bakes the bread of profit. Again, this kind of goes back to Cloud Atlas, right? Where you have in the dystopian future, Somni is a clone that works in a McDonald's and she doesn't have a real life. And in some ways, these guys are also like forced to go to this other end of the world where they don't really fit in or understand what's going on. And these aren't like well-educated guys or anything. They're just like, workers, cooks, stevedores, and what have you. And they are just trying to turn a profit or work any angle that they possibly can so that they can just have their little creature comforts of whatever they can eke out in the colony. And there are a bunch of distasteful characters. I don't want to color them as pure victims because I think the story goes to great lengths in order to show that while these guys are being caught up in this ideological machine that's so much bigger than they are, at the same time, they're not great people. They're deceitful. They are corrupt. They don't follow the rules of their own institution, but also who can blame them when they're being exploited by it? They're not good Christians or anything. And so everybody's a little bit more shades of gray, a little bit more complicated than any of these ideological institutions would rather them be. All of the institutions would rather them kind of be cogs in a machine, but nobody fits nicely into those things because they're kind of nicely rounded characters. They're fully human. And so that's part of the pleasure of the book, I think, that it's easy to believe that all of these people are people because nothing is kind of fitting into these neat little categories. So Jacob and Arito meet, but far from the two of them clashing because of what might be differing ideologies, Jacob is smitten with her. And despite his goal of trying to make a little bit of money to go home and marry his girl, he is immediately infatuated with her and basically falls in love with her at first sight and wants to learn how to romance her and possibly marry her for as long as he's going to be in Japan. Last time I talked about how, or maybe it wasn't last time, maybe it was in Cloud Atlas. I can't really remember, but I know previously I talked about how Bakhtin had ideas about place and time and how legends, folktales, and older stories like that dealt with time in such a way, according to him, that when this moment would happen and the hero of the story sees the love interest of the story and instantly falls in love with her, then a series of misadventures would happen that would arrest time during the interlude of the misadventures, and then time would resume after the couple is reunited and their love has not dwindled or changed or diminished. Instead, it's just as simple and strong as it was in that initial moment of falling in love at first sight. And there's something of that flavor here with Jacob and Arito, at least for Jacob. But I think it's so much more interesting because of the way, especially that it gets characterized at the end. And so this is, I think, a trope that Mitchell is self-consciously activating for us as readers. That we're, like I said, maybe you have someone pick up this book who's not a Mitchell reader, and then they're like, oh, I'm going to read a historical novel. Here's the European guy. Oh, of course, he finds an Oriental woman and falls in love with her. Okay, I see the shape of this story. Okay, let's go on this romantic adventure. But it's all going to be a little bit more complicated, right? So we see throughout part one different examples of Jacob being a pretty good, so he's like an accountant, and he's pretty good at not getting fooled by people. As we meet those guys who got press ganged into the company or tricked or whatever, they try to trick Jacob or sound him out to see if he's corrupt or will take bribes or be interested in things like that. And he never is. And he's never taken in by their schemes either. And in fact, in some ways, he's kind of laying traps to find out who's corrupt and who has integrity among the employees, because that's part of his reason for being there, or so he believes, because he's part of a new administration that is supposed to be replacing the previous corrupt group who was keeping kind of set of double books. On the one hand, they were telling the company, oh, we only have this much in resources and we're selling this much. But in reality, they actually had much, much more, and they were selling things at a personal profit that they were keeping for themselves. So this new guy is supposed to not do that. He's coming in as a reformer. His name is Vorstenbach, I think, but I'm not Dutch, so I'm probably saying that wrong, Vorstenbach. And he's replacing another guy named Snitker. Again, maybe I'm messing that up. So Vorstenbach is in, Snitker is out. Snitker is a corrupt guy. And Jacob admires Vorstenbach because of his reformist, true and blue, loyal to the company, let's make profits the right way style administration. And so what we see here is Jacob's integrity, his intelligence, his wisdom, and all of this culminates, I guess in this first part, you could kind of see the antagonism in the story as being the corruption within the company itself. And Jacob is fighting against that and working to restore integrity to the institution. And he does that because of his sincerely held Christian values, right? So through and through, this is the guy that Jacob is. He's not putting on an act. He's not trying to fool anybody. He literally just follows his conscience and lives his values, which come from the Christian tradition that his father, who was a minister, taught him. This culminates in the climax of the first part, where it's revealed that Vorstenbach is actually just up to the same old game that Snitka was. It's just that he is, and he's just making it so that him and his cronies are going to make the profit instead of the old guy and his cronies. So they kicked all these guys off to go to jail on the boat going back home. And now that they are set up, they're going to enjoy the corruption of taking extra profits from the Japanese people and not reporting them back to the company. And Jacob refuses to ratify the contracts that are associated with this corruption, the false reporting. He won't do it. And in fact, he rips up the contract in front of everybody. which immediately gets him demoted and puts him under the thumb of the people that saw him as arrogant and no fun. The people that he was kind of lording it over and being like, hey, I'm doing the right thing and you're doing the wrong thing. And so in a way, at the end of part one, Jacob has lost. Like everything that he came here to achieve in Japan is ruined because of his commitment to his integrity and to his Christian values. And so the real clash of ideologies that we've had here is, on the one hand, a purely capitalist kind of profit motive that extends beyond the institutional goals of the Dutch East India Company and instead, runs to like personal profit. And so these kind of personal entrepreneurs, these corrupt officials, are running up against Jacob's sincerely held Christian morals of integrity and truth-telling. And in the competition between those two, the Christianity loses because it has no institutional power. It has no power within the context of the government. In part two, we switch to the point of view of Orito, who was on Dejima studying with the wonderful Dr. Marinus, who is such a great character. I love Marinus so much. He's such a grouch, such another guy who has his own personal ideology and a deep commitment to his own personal integrity, but is not ideologically aligned with capital or with Christianity, but instead has his own personal way of seeing the world and is just like such a grump about doing his own thing. He's so great. But anyway, he is the teacher of Orito and maybe his greatest student, which of course in this time period is a little bit scandalous because she's a woman. How can it be that she could learn science and medicine? And of course, in this period in Japanese society, being an unmarried woman, she is essentially the property of her birth family. And when her father dies, her mother sells her off to a local monastery who is interested in her knowledge of midwifery because they have had problems with many women dying in childbirth. The monastery there has several nuns. And these would be, I guess, Buddhist. It's not totally clear to me. It seems, I want to say like Shinto, but Shinto is like not a religion the way that Buddhism, and that sounds really bad, but you have to understand that like Shinto is a almost postmodern construction of more diverse beliefs that are scattered across Japanese islands that are not unified in a way that we imagine Japan today. I said islands, but what I mean is the main island of Japan. There were many different groups of people who did not see themselves as linked to one another as a single people the way that we do in the 20th century or that Japanese people do now. And they had a diversity of beliefs, and all of those beliefs are kind of like rounded up under the umbrella of what is called Shinto in the 20th century and celebrated as like, oh, these are all like a coherent set of beliefs, but they're really not a coherent set of beliefs as compared to Buddhism or Christianity. In any case, the monastery is quite ancient, and it has both monks and nuns who live there. Orito is not happy about going to this place. It ends her study of science, and it puts her in a position where she feels sure that she will be forced to have a baby. Orito was badly scarred before the story begins on her face by a burn. And so she's never been married. And because the way that Japanese culture works, she's never had a romantic relationship, a sexual relationship with anyone. And she doesn't really want to have sex with any of these monks who live in this place. Most of the women who are nuns in the monastery, she finds out, used to be prostitutes in various local areas. And much like with Jacob's part one, she gets the personal testimony of various women who didn't choose because of religious convictions to come to the monastery and, study or meditate on a life of spirituality. They were recruited and forced to come here because of the needs of the monastery itself and because the monastery needs to exploit people in order to exist. So again, we are hitting that theme of religion. And with Orito, we have somebody who thinks according to the structure of the scientific method, who believes in science and in knowledge, but at the same time is interacting with a religious institution. And so before Jacob's religious convictions crumpled under the power of the capitalist Dutch East India Company, and in this case, Orito's desires are squashed by the power of the religious institution. And so it's not that religion loses because it is religion in this story. That would be the kind of monological voice that I've talked about in Bakhtein's theories, the idea that, oh, well, David Mitchell is not a Christian or he's an atheist, and therefore in his writing, he will have the view that religion is bad, therefore religion always loses. So Jacob de Zoet loses because he is religious. Well, this interrupts that type of pattern and shows that, no, religion can be very powerful. What we should be paying attention to instead are the patterns of what institutions are valuing. Is it people? Is it power? Is it self-perpetuation? And then how do we feel about that as readers? What kind of institution would we rather see? I think that's the point of what Mitchell is constructing here in terms of watching these ideological institutions butt up against our characters' lives. That being said, Orito has supernatural dreams that involve a moon gray cat who I haven't mentioned up until this point, that is a reoccurring character throughout the books. I'm trying to remember if the moon gray cat appears in Ghostwritten. I can never find it, but I have the feeling like it does. And even if it doesn't, it probably does, if you know what I mean. Like it's probably in there somewhere. It's just not mentioned in the sentences, so to speak. The moon gray cat pops up often. It's definitely popped up before this. I just haven't mentioned it. And part of the reason that I don't usually talk about the moon gray cat is because I can't figure out exactly what it means or what it means to me. Is it like Schrodinger's cat? Is like when it shows up, is there like some kind of liminal possibility space that's being explored? Or is it just like, cats, a black cat is bad luck, therefore a white cat would be good luck, therefore a gray cat would be I don't know what that means. I know gray is an important color in Zen Buddhism, the Japanese practice of Zazen. So grayness has a kind of equilibrium, a kind of stoic removal from the desire for good or bad outcomes, but merely an acceptance of whatever outcome needs to happen in the working out of karma. I don't know. Sometimes the cat appears in the story as a dead cat, and that usually signals something bad. And then sometimes the cat just shows up and I can't quite figure out what it means. But in this case, the cat says words. And so that's a little bit more clear, right? And the cat tells Orito there is a way out of this room and it is found below, and this is the way to get there. And she wakes up from the dream and she follows the path that the cat took. And indeed, there is a way out of the shrine and maybe out of this kind of imprisonment that she's found herself in. I really like this moment for Arito's character because she manages to get pretty far away from the shrine, and it puts her in a position where she's not being held captive against her will at this point, right? She's found a means of escape, and she has to make an active choice of, do I leave and find my freedom, whatever that might mean. There's not a whole lot of freedom to be had as a single woman with a facial scar in 1800s Japan, but it's got to be better than being the multiple rape victim of monks in a shrine for the rest of your life at the same time, right? But Orito thinks about all of those women who are up at the shrine that are pregnant that she met and who are going to deliver babies, and how she could be the one who could save their lives and could save the lives of the babies. And she makes the choice to go back for that reason. And I think this is really important that she makes the decision to do that as an act of conscience, that she feels that this is the right thing to do, and that is what motivates her decision to do it. She doesn't do it because it's easier. She doesn't do it because she has a deep desire to be at the shrine, right? She does it because of a conviction of what is the right thing to do. What is her responsibility? What would satisfy her personal conscience? And that is the same kind of decision that Jacob made. And both of those decisions feel very morally heroic, but at the same time, they come at a deep cost, and they both benefit the institutions that I think we as readers are made to feel are unfair and bad for our protagonists. And so Jacob and Orito are kind of entwined structurally through this parallel structure of making a choice based on their moral convictions above all else. They could both make much more comfortable decisions for themselves, but their integrity is more important to them than that. And if you think back to the previous book of Black Swan Green, and especially the ending of that, you have this idea that if you are true to yourself and you just put the truth out there, then people can accept it or reject it or get over it or whatever. That is their problem. It's not your problem. And that the universe will kind of settle into its rightful place if you just stick to the truth. Then everything just kind of shakes out to its own level, at least as far as you yourself are concerned. That's kind of like where I think the novel lands. And that makes a lot of sense if you're a kid growing up into early adulthood. But we can see that when you apply that lesson in this book to, like, these are two characters who are really sticking to their own personal integrity and taking their personal conscience really seriously. They're putting themselves out there authentically to people, and they are not just being rejected, but being exploited by the institutions around them. Power is reaching out to do whatever it wants to them, despite applying that lesson. And so it's like we've almost regressed into the lessons learned in Cloud Atlas, where it was, the weak are meat, the strong do eat. And right now, Jacob and Orito are the weak who are getting eaten. The other thing that happens in this part of the book is we have the character Ogawa Uzaimon, who is a translator for the Japanese people and a friend to Jacob. He has secretly been in love with Orito since before the story began, and he wants to go and rescue her. And so he hires some mercenaries that he knows, and he's also been able to gather some secret information about the shrine and the rituals that they perform that is the prime motivation for why he's going to go try to save Orito. And that in these secret shrine documents, it outlines that the monks take the babies that are born and serve them up to a goddess that takes their life essence and then allows them, like, it distills the life essence, and then they're able to consume it somehow, and it lets the monks live forever, which is just like heinous and deranged and crazy, right? Like so you hear this and you're like, oh my God, how could anybody believe in this? Like, that's ridiculous. And I think it goes a step further to be like, religion is crazy. Anybody who believes in religion is crazy. I think it invites people who are already maybe a little bit prejudiced against organized religion to be like, see, this is what they're all like. They're nuts. And I think it's a little bit of a trap because of the way that the book ends, but a clever trap in a way. And I think it's a trap that has a point to it. Because again, it's not just about religions or supernatural stuff is crazy and science is right. It's about institutions. And in this case, the supernatural stuff, the religious people are actually correct. This whole process does actually work. They are able to distill the souls of babies and somehow consume them and live for hundreds of years. The head guy at the shrine, named Enomoto, he's like 600 years old, according to what he tells them in the story. And, I think you could read this book like in isolation without having read Mitchell's other books and be like, well, that guy's just crazy. He's in a cult and he has, drunk his own Kool-Aid and believes his own bullshit. But I think that given everything that we have seen in the other books about reincarnation and psychic phenomenon, the sojourner in Mongolia from Ghost Written and all that stuff, we know that this is probably actually really happening. And so because it is really happening, I think that changes the dynamic of it. This isn't just about religion, because this whole thing works. And you'd be like, well, supernatural stuff is just unreasonable and crazy. We can't base a society on it. Well, in this case, it does actually work. The cost of it working is this really heinous circumstance of, kill several babies for one person to live many more years. And so now it's a moral question, and it's not a question about science versus religion or this or that, right? Now it becomes something different that's about your conscience and that's about moral integrity. I mean, like, nobody wants to die, right? Most of us are not ready to let go of life yet. But are you so attached to life that you would kill someone else? Are you so attached to life, would you kill a baby? Like, how far would you go? I think most people, their conscience would get in the way at this point. So Uzaimon has discovered this secret, or that, he doesn't really believe that it's possible, but he discovers that this is the thing that's happening up in the shrine. And so he wants to get Orito out of it. Unfortunately, they get all the way to the shrine, but the whole thing was a honey trap for Enomoto to get the documents back, because he needs to keep his secret. If somebody found out about this whole thing, then, somebody with power, then he could be destroyed. But Uzaimon was smart enough to give the documents to Zoet before he went off to try and do the rescue. And so Zoet has the secret documents, and Uzaimon is killed for the escape attempt. And so it seems as if it's like Enomoto kind of steps forward at this point. He's, this isn't the first glimpse that we get of the character or anything. We've seen him before, but he was merely kind of like a political player up to this point, and he really steps forward as a more sinister villain with supernatural powers that seem to be legitimate. He's a much scarier figure all of a sudden because he crafted this very clever trap for Uzaimon. And so it really seemed like Arito was going to get away, and then everything just falls apart at the end of part 2 there. One way or another, she was going to save herself, or Uzaimon was going to save her, or something. Or somebody was going to find out about Enomoto, and like none of it worked out, and it's just heartbreaking. It's a really good dramatic turn. And so we move into part 3, where we get a brand new antagonist entering the story in the form of Captain Penhaligon, who is a British sea captain. And so we get a whole nother national institution moving into the area. And he has picked up Snitka, the former Dutch boss of the area. And Snitka has given him all of the intelligence that he needs to invade Dejima and displace the administration that displaced him. And so he's going to use the English to get his revenge on his co-workers, basically. But what he doesn't know, and Captain Penhaligon does, is that the entire East Dutch India Company has gone bankrupt and doesn't exist anymore. And furthermore, their government has been conquered by Napoleon. So they are completely wiped out. And there's a power vacuum now on the island of Dejima, even though nobody notices it, or nobody knows about it yet, which is like this really interesting kind of time dilation of empires that's only possible at a time like this in history, right? Where multiple governments can be operating as if everything is normal, but the truth is that everything has fallen apart on the Dutch side, and the Japanese don't know it. And the Dutch people don't know that they're out of a job and that they don't even have a ruler anymore. They're like a part of France. Which goes to show that, like, as powerful as the institution might be, but putting your identity and putting your welfare into the institution is not really as safe as it might seem, because those institutions are prone to topple and crumble, in addition to being so completely self-interested that they exploit people to begin with. And so it's almost like if you're going to be exploited, if you're going to be part of an institution which inevitably will fail, you might as well have integrity and self-respect. You know what I mean? Like, being somebody like Jacob puts you down at the bottom of things, I guess, and being like Orito, they're both almost basically slaves and live a very uncomfortable life, but at least it's a life that they have self-respect and integrity. They didn't trade something inside of themselves away for comfort. And Captain Penhaligon here, speaking of that, is like a very uncomfortable guy in that has a gouty sickness. He's got all kinds of infections in his leg and stuff that have to do with, like, his doctor follows unscientific quackery, as Marinus might call it, where he's bloodletting, he's putting mice feces into his wounds to cure them, and trying to stimulate pus and all of this gross stuff that he's probably just going to die from the kind of medical treatment that he's getting. And it's kind of interesting that we get a glimpse into that vulnerability that Penhaligon has, because he definitely is the antagonist of this part of the story, where he's trying to destroy what's left of Zoet's, I guess, job or position, or like whatever he's got going on now that he's lost his friend Uzaimon and Orito is gone, and he's trying to decipher what's in this scroll and figure out like why was Uzaimon willing to die for this? What happened to Orito? What's the information in this thing? Meanwhile, this guy Penhaligon is creeping up on the over the horizon, and he's going to invade the port city. And so that's exactly what happens. He manages to get into the port, and there's all kinds of trickery that goes on, and then he starts firing on them. And the upside is that the Dutchmen learn the truth about everything, that they've been conquered, that their business has gone bankrupt, that they're not going to get anything. Nobody's coming to take them back to Europe. They're stuck here in Japan now. And they have to come down to a decision about what they're going to do about it and how they're going to deal with the English. And all of them know that there's one person in this group that they can trust. And that's Jacob de Zoet, because he's the guy who has integrity, who stands by what he thinks. And he's the guy who's going to do the right thing no matter what. And before, it drove all of them crazy. But now it's the thing that they really need, because there's nothing else left to build their lives around. And so his steadiness becomes the foundation for their ability to rally around somebody and fight back against the English. And so Jacob comes up with a plan. It's kind of a crazy plan where they're just going to like make a brave stand of it and let themselves be fired upon. Jacob and Marinus stand up on like a wall, and they're getting fired on, and they're just talking about like, oh man, we're gonna die any minute, and stuff is blowing up all around them, and they don't flinch or run away. They don't lower their flag. And this stand like reminds Penhaligon about his son, who also like he probably died bravely, and it moves him, and he ends up, this whole thing like ends up earning Jacob even more respect from all the people involved in the story. And there's the local high official Shiroyama, who is really impressed by de Zoet's stand against the English, and the whole thing pays off, and they're able to repel the attack, and things calm down. And because Shiroyama is so impressed with Jacob, they end up talking, and Jacob has translated the scroll successfully. He understands what's going on at the shrine, kind of, and he's appalled by it, of course. And he gives Shiroyama the scroll. He explains to him everything that's going on. And then Shiroyama, who has been playing the game Go on again, off again with Enomoto over the years, goes to play a final game with him and poisons their sake over the game, and they both die. And so Shiroyama is willing to kill himself in order to right this wrong that Enomoto is perpetrating, has, this evil that has been happening at the shrine for hundreds of years. At one point in this Go game, there's the thought that, are they playing Go or is Go playing them? And I feel a resonance of that idea with the call that Luisa Ray makes in Ghost Written to the Bat Segundo show, where she claims that all the lunatics and writers in the world and all of the crazy stories that people call in with at night are just part of a larger story that the whole universe is wrapped up in, and that everybody is in a story. The story is playing them. They aren't making the story. And then later, there's an idea of providence that's introduced, which of course would be a part of Zoet's Christian beliefs, especially his Lutheran beliefs. And we know from Number 9 Dream and to a degree from Cloud Atlas that there is a kind of providence to Mitchell's world, that there is a kind of overstory or a hand guiding things. And we know that as readers metatextually because the entire thing is a fictional story that's being written by the hand of David Mitchell. And so, of course, there's a guiding hand. There's the guiding hand of David Mitchell. And so I think it is pointing out to us, like the characters are almost aware that they're in a book in a weird way, but also isn't that a feeling that we get in our own lives where weird synchronicities or serendipities manifest and they feel surprising and mysterious to us and like they're almost linked to some other power guiding us, that we aren't living our lives, but our lives are part of a wider story that we don't fully understand. Because when Shiroyama kills Enomoto, the practice of the shrine falls apart, and the whole knowledge of how to distill the souls of babies in order to elongate your life goes away. And so Orito later meets up with Zoet many, many years later in the next part and suggests to him that, like, yeah, maybe things could have gone differently. You could have done this. I could have done that. But if we had, then the shrine would still be there and it would still be killing babies and it would still be this great evil there. And it is almost as if we were placed as if on a go board to overturn this evil and make things right. And so even though it was like uncomfortable and difficult for them, and it felt like they lost at the time, really they were uncovering a greater win for history, which gets back to the themes and ideas that were happening in Cloud Atlas, right? And on a smaller scale, you could see that too with Jason in the previous book, with like his parents were going through all this violence and pain as their marriage was breaking up. But at the end of things, it was actually better because his father ended up with somebody that maybe he always would have been better off with because he knew her from the time he was a schoolboy. And his mother really flourished because of the entire divorce. And she got a career that she loves and she like got all of her confidence back and she just seems so much happier. And so actually his parents were better off for having gone through the divorce. And so not all darkness that comes into things means that there won't be light again later. And in fact, there might be a greater light because of it. So while the story might feel as if it is rejecting at various times religion or Christianity, at the end of the story, it ratifies the notion of a providence to things, that it's as if the world is scripted and that script tends towards a kind of justice. And that maybe the reason for injustice and evil, if there can be said to be a reason, is so that it can be overturned and righted, so that people have the choice to do good, if you will. But it's also not clear. I don't know. Maybe that's going too far, right? Like, because I don't know that Providence is setting things up that much, or maybe there's more than one Providence. I don't know. These ideas, though, are introduced at this point in the larger meta-narrative of these novels, and they'll be explored more in the following book, The Bone Clocks. So I'm kind of tipping my hand here, I guess, a little bit. But this book ends up, in the final part, in part 5, exploring even the end of Zoet's life. And we follow him all the way into death and beyond death, where after he dies, he sees Orito in the afterlife and she greets him into the afterlife. And so it's like I said earlier, with the entire fairy tale thing of love at first sight, they have this deep connection, and it's complicated over time by all of these circumstances. And even though, like, she could have loved this person or that person, she could have been with Uzaimon instead, or maybe nobody at all and just had her independence. The connection that the two of them had was so deep, at least for Zoet. And who knows if it's a vision or if it's a really true supernatural event that happens at the end of his life. And in any event, for Zoet, it affirms the way that he feels about her and how that never changed from the first time that he saw her. And I think there's something there about love and the connection of love and the power that that has in our life. Love is something that has been a repeating theme in the books since the very first one in Ghost Written. And the questions around, is it just a biological trick? Is it just a manifestation of desire? This moment to me would seem to say that it's something that transcends that it's bigger than that. And it might feed into that providence that he really need to have that connection with Arito in order to be the one that Uzaimon would trust with the secret information. And then he would have to care about her enough to translate the information, because it wasn't easy for him to do that. So he had to have some motivation for that to happen, and being in love with her was that motivation. And his love for her is what toppled that evil shrine at the end of the day. And so I guess what I'm saying is, like, the power of love there is something that destroys evil in the story. And the evil that is in the story isn't about this supernatural evil. It isn't about religion. It happens to be that in that case. But Zoet's bravery and his integrity is the same thing that lets him stand up to the English invasion. It's what allows him to stand up to the corruption of the Dutch minister. And so the problem is these institutions. It's these exploiters of people. And the thing that fights against that is personal integrity. It's truth. It's love. These are the big things in Mitchell's universe that motivate the goodness in the world to combat the badness. And so this story has a really unique arc to it, right? Where there's not like any primary antagonist situated in history. The antagonists move around at this point in the story. At the beginning, it's the corrupt Dutch ministers, and then it becomes Enomoto, and then it becomes Penhanigan, and then it goes back to Enomoto. So there's no straight line of conflict, like here's the good guys, here's the bad guys. I think it's about these wider ideas, but also the very intimate human experiences that we have in our day-to-day lives, of the choices we make, the consequences that they manifest, but then the wider consequences that build into the sweeping changes in the world that we can't control or understand until much, much later when we look back. And just the complicated web of that. And so it's just really delightful to read a book that is so poised and balanced in that complexity, but has something that it's really saying, I think. And that it's saying something so moral and thoughtful and interesting and inclusive, because, by getting the perspective of Orito and seeing into the shrine of Enomoto, we're not romanticizing the Japanese against the Europeans, right? These aren't the noble savages, and the Europeans are the dirty colonizers. The Europeans are the dirty colonizers, but they're also the ones who were forced into it unfairly and were basically enslaved. Oh, but also the Japanese people are doing evil things as well. But wait a minute, there's also Japanese heroes like Uzaimon who are genuinely good people. And so there's just complicated humanity on every side of it. There's female heroes, there's British villains coming in, and then we get all the little connections to the other books that are sprinkled in. We get one of the guys in the English crew, I think, is a Montevere. So he's Mo Montevere's ancestor, who is the one who develops Zookeeper at some point in the future and changes the course of humanity. And we're in this part of the world where E.G., his island is just like over there, very, very close to here, where he asked the Thunder God to give him the power to play soccer better than anybody else. And so we've got all these little connections across all the books. And at the same time, we're telling this very interesting story at this point in history about the clash of ideologies with the human phenomenon of love and conscience and the desire for freedom. Just a really beautiful book. And so next we'll be reading what's probably my favorite David Mitchell book, not to spoil things, The Bone Clocks. So I'm really looking forward to that.